If you're doing your zone 2 on a bike, is there an ideal cadence to hold in order to stay in zone 2? This is what we're going to look at in today's video. I got a question from one of the subscribers on the French channel, and she asked why when she would drop her cadence by about 10 RPMs, why her legs would start to burn even though she kept the same wattage, and she was at 115 BPMs, 115 of heart rate, and she was easily in zone 2, so easy to breathe, nothing hard in the legs, no difficulty, no burning, no nothing, no fatigue, and about 75 RPMs on the bike. And when she dropped her cadence to 65, her heart rate would typically drop a little bit as well, by about 3-4 beats, but her legs would start to burn a little bit. And she was wondering how cadence influenced this, and can cadence alone make you get out of your zone 2 if you're staying at the same power output, at the same external load? So there's a couple easy ways to get around that question. And for this, I'm going to show you a little visual on the screen here. And what we see here is 3 different cadences that I picked just to kind of exemplify this idea. You have 50 rounds per minute on the left, 80 in the middle, and 120 on the right. So 50 is obviously very low cadence. We don't typically do a lot of this unless we're doing kind of strength work on the bike or some specific climbing kind of workouts for different conditions in a race, for example. You have the 80 RPMs in the middle, which is kind of the middle ground, the kind of average for most people and for most sessions, and then 120 RPMs, which is typically what we'll find on a sprint or very, very high cadence work. And the way we can model all this is that when you're at low cadence, you will have a high muscular demand, simply because you have to produce a lot of force for each pedal stroke. The heart contribution will be a little bit lower because the legs are doing a lot of the work. So you can think in peripheral and central factors. And obviously at lower cadences, you have a higher demand on the peripheral factors, on the strength expression of the muscle itself. Whereas at higher cadences, you'll have less of a muscular demand and a bit more on the cardiac side, simply because now you have to push more blood around and your muscles just don't have to produce as much force on each contraction, on each pedal stroke. But the neuromuscular or the neural demand will be a little bit higher than at lower cadences because you just have to coordinate the movement, the cycling movement a bit better. And then finally, if we push it to the extreme on the right, 120 RPMs, you would pretty much maximize the muscular demand, the cardiovascular demand, and the neuromuscular demand as well, given the high intensity that you are producing. So with this said, now what is actually happening? As we saw just now, when you drop your cadence, even if you keep the same external load, the same wattage in this case, if you drop your cadence, you will put more, let's say, stress on the legs themselves and on the force production of the legs. And typically you will decrease the demands on the heart. And this is why you saw or you felt an increase tension and more difficulty in the legs, but more fatigue in the legs and a drop in the heart rate. So that kind of plays together, right? You're going to get more leg demand and less cardiovascular demand by decreasing your cadence. And so the question was, I was in zone 2 before. She was at 115 BPMs and at 75 RPMs, and she was feeling good and easy on the bike. But as soon as she dropped to 65, she started feeling like it was harder, and she was no longer in a zone 2 type effort. And keep in mind here, we're talking about zone 2 in a 5-zone model. So zone 2 being low intensity, below the first lactate or ventilatory threshold, whichever method you want to use to conceptualize this. And so the idea is that first recommendation that I would give is don't ride just on the limit of your zone 2, zone 3. So don't be stuck at the top of your zone 2. You typically want to leave a bit of breathing room so that no matter what, you're going to stay in your zone 2. And no, it's not a big deal if you temporarily go over, or even if you go over for a part of the session or for a whole session. Nobody's going to die if you go into zone 3 instead of zone 2. But if you want to keep the fatigue at minimal levels. And if you want to recover as best as you can for the next day harder session, typically you want to keep that under the first ventilatory threshold. That's also where you'll be able to accumulate the most volume. So typically people recommend 80 to 90% of your first threshold for your zone 2 work. And that's typically what I would do. So if you're at 115 BPMs in heart rate and you feel like you're just at the limit of your zone 2, I would maybe drop it and do your zone 2 around 105 to 110 BPMs. And that would be the heart rate that I target. And if you don't feel comfortable at lower cadences, I would maybe do some targeted blocks of work or maybe some short intervals during a longer session that are focused on the lower cadence, even with similar watts as what you did or as what you typically do on your zone 2, just to train that aspect of it as well and be comfortable with the lower cadence. But also I would push your cadence a little bit higher, and I would try to challenge yourself to maintain 80, 85, maybe 90 at times RPMs instead of the 75. 75 for me would be just a little bit on the low end of what I would want to see. I would typically want to see 80 to 85 on average. And the higher level the cyclist, typically the higher the cadence that you'll find, even at the lower relative intensities for those athletes. And I do think it's a good exercise to learn how to coordinate a faster movement and a faster pedal stroke. And I'm not even getting into technical considerations of how to push on a pedal here. This is out of my realm of expertise. We're just talking about energetics and here the neuromuscular demand of coordinating a faster motion on the bike, and how when people aren't used to doing this, it's typically more tiring just from the brain standpoint of having to keep a certain cadence and keeping a faster motion. This is also something that you can train. So train at lower cadences, but drop your wattage and your heart rate, and train at higher cadences. And obviously there you'll probably feel easier in the legs, and you'll see a heart rate that's a little bit more elevated, but that's not a big deal again, especially if you take that margin off of that first threshold and make sure you stay conservative when you do your zone 2 work, so that you could do a bit more variation in terms of cadence and also just more duration and more volume while making sure you stay below that first ventilatory threshold. So here you are for this video. I hope I was able to shed some light on some of those concepts. If you have more questions, please leave them in the comments below. Thanks for always watching and commenting, and I'll see you in the next video.